What if the part of you that hates your life isn't broken at all, but exhausted from pretending this is the life you wanted? And what if the hardest thing to admit isn't that you're unhappy, but that you've quietly become someone you barely recognize anymore without even noticing it? Most people imagine hating your life as something dramatic. They picture someone who has completely given up, someone who can't get out of bed, someone whose pain is obvious to everyone around them. But that's rarely how it looks. More often, it looks ordinary. You wake up when you're supposed to, you answer messages, you go to work, you laugh when someone tells a joke, you keep plans you secretly hoped would be cancelled. From the outside, nothing seems terribly wrong. Yet there is this strange heaviness that follows you through the day, as if every small task asks for more energy than you actually have. The difficult part isn't always the sadness. Sometimes it's the absence of almost everything else. The excitement you used to feel before trying something new disappears so gradually that you can't remember when it left. Conversations begin to feel strangely repetitive. The people around you haven't necessarily changed, but somehow every interaction feels slightly further away than it used to. You find yourself listening without really being present, smiling without fully feeling it, wondering whether everyone else is just better at pretending than you are. Then night arrives, and the silence becomes impossible to negotiate with. You replay conversations that happened years ago. You imagine different versions of your future, none of which seem convincing. You promise yourself that tomorrow will feel different. But somewhere inside, another voice quietly asks why tomorrow would change when yesterday didn't. You don't always believe that voice, but you can't completely ignore it either. What's unsettling is how quickly this becomes normal. Humans adapt to almost anything, including emotional emptiness. After enough time, you stop asking whether you're happy. You begin asking smaller questions instead. Can I just get through this week? Can I make it to Friday? Can I get through this dinner without someone noticing how distant I feel? Without realizing it, your life starts shrinking into manageable pieces, not because you're living, but because surviving feels more realistic than hoping. People often misunderstand this state. They think you're becoming cold, lazy, ungrateful, or difficult. Some tell you to appreciate what you already have. Others remind you that someone else has it worse. Those words aren't necessarily wrong. They simply fail to reach the place where this feeling actually lives, because this isn't always about having a bad life. Sometimes it's about living a life that no longer belongs to you. That realization is uncomfortable because it doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives as small moments that seem insignificant until they begin connecting together. You notice how often you say yes when you wanted to say no. You realize most of your decisions are made to avoid disappointing someone else. You can't remember the last time you asked yourself what you genuinely wanted without immediately thinking about everyone else's expectations. At some point, pleasing people stopped feeling like kindness and quietly became the price of belonging. And perhaps that's where something inside began drifting. Not all at once, not after one heartbreak or one failure. More like standing on a shoreline where the tide slowly pulls the sand beneath your feet. You don't notice each wave. You only notice, one day, that you're standing somewhere completely different from where you started. The frightening part isn't losing your direction. It's losing the feeling that you ever had one. There are moments when you catch your reflection unexpectedly and feel an odd distance from the person looking back. Nothing appears different, yet something feels unfamiliar. You remember versions of yourself who laughed more freely, who became curious without forcing it, who didn't analyze every word before speaking. You wonder where that person went, and for a second you almost convince yourself they never really existed. But that question lingers, not because it demands an immediate answer, but because it points towards something you've been avoiding for a long time. Perhaps the life you dislike today wasn't created by one catastrophic decision. Perhaps it was built through hundreds of quiet moments when you slowly abandoned yourself without realizing you were doing it. And if that's true, then the place where this feeling began may not be where you've always assumed. In the next part, we'll begin looking beneath the surface of this quiet dissatisfaction, not at what happened around you, but at the invisible psychological patterns that slowly convinced you this life was the only one you could live. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. After living that way for long enough, something subtle begins to happen. You stop measuring your days by how they felt and start measuring them by whether you made it through without causing problems. If nobody was disappointed in you, if no uncomfortable conversation happened, if nothing fell apart, then you quietly call it a good day. Not because it brought you peace, but because it demanded very little from the part of you that's already running on empty. It's strange how invisible this becomes. You don't wake up one morning and decide to abandon yourself. Instead, you slowly become more attentive to everyone else's emotional weather than your own. You notice when a friend sounds slightly irritated. You immediately wonder whether you said something wrong. Someone replies with a shorter message than usual, and a small uneasiness follows you for hours. Meanwhile, your own disappointment, frustration, or sadness waits patiently in the background, almost as if it has learned that it will never be addressed first. Then there are those moments that seem too ordinary to matter, yet somehow stay with you. You're standing in a grocery store, staring at shelves, realizing you don't actually know what you feel like eating. Someone asks what movie you want to watch, and your mind goes blank. You answer, "I don't mind," because that's become your automatic response. At first, it sounds polite. Eventually, it starts sounding like a description of your entire relationship with your own life. Perhaps that's why certain memories return so unexpectedly. Not the dramatic ones people expect you to carry, but tiny fragments that make no logical sense. The version of yourself who laughed without checking who was listening. The afternoon you became fascinated by something simply because it interested you, not because it was useful. A conversation where you felt completely understood without needing to explain yourself. These moments arrive quietly, then disappear before you can fully hold onto them, leaving behind a question that's difficult to ignore. When did life stop feeling that immediate? You may even notice yourself becoming a spectator inside experiences that should matter. Friends gather around the same table they've gathered around for years, everyone speaks, everyone laughs, yet a small part of you watches the entire evening from somewhere slightly outside yourself. You participate, but you never fully arrive. On the drive home, you don't remember much of what was said. You only remember feeling strangely absent while your body stayed present. There is another habit that almost never gets noticed. Whenever something genuinely good happens, your mind moves past it surprisingly fast. A compliment feels uncomfortable. A small achievement barely registers before you're thinking about the next responsibility. Yet one awkward interaction, one criticism, one careless comment from someone else can replay itself for days. It's almost as if your attention has quietly learned that discomfort deserves to be remembered more than joy. Over time, you become incredibly functional. You know exactly what people expect from you. You know which version of yourself fits different rooms. Around family, you become one person. Around co-workers, another. Around old friends, someone else entirely. None of these versions are completely false, but neither do they feel completely real. And after switching between them for years, an unsettling thought appears. If every version belongs to someone else, which one actually belongs to you? That question usually doesn't arrive during dramatic moments. It appears while brushing your teeth before bed, while sitting in traffic, while scrolling through people whose lives seem strangely vivid compared to your own. For a second, everything feels unfamiliar, not because your surroundings have changed, but because you've lost the feeling of participating in your own existence. You're watching the days pass with remarkable efficiency, yet somehow they no longer feel like your days. What's unsettling is that people often praise this version of you. They describe you as dependable, mature, easygoing, someone who never asks for much. Those words should feel comforting. Instead, they leave behind a quiet discomfort you can't quite explain. Because somewhere inside, another thought whispers that perhaps they've become attached to the version of you that never makes life difficult, not necessarily the version that feels alive. And maybe that's why changing your life becomes so confusing. The problem doesn't always look like suffering. Sometimes it looks like endless adaptation, repeated so often that you've mistaken it for your personality. What feels natural now may have started as survival long ago. And if that's true, then these patterns aren't random at all. In the next part, we'll begin looking at the hidden psychological force beneath these quiet habits, the invisible process that slowly teaches a person to disconnect from themselves while believing they're simply becoming who they were always meant to be. Maybe the hardest realization isn't that you've been living a life you dislike. It's discovering that somewhere along the way, you became responsible for protecting yourself from experiences that no longer exist. The strange part is that this protection doesn't feel like fear anymore. It feels like common sense. It feels like maturity. It feels like who you are. There is a quiet moment that many people never notice. It happens when you stop asking, "What do I want?" and begin asking, "What will keep everything peaceful?" Those two questions sound almost identical from the outside, but they slowly build completely different lives. One is led by curiosity, the other is led by caution. At first, caution seems harmless. It helps you avoid conflict. It keeps relationships stable. It makes you someone others can rely on. But after enough years, you realize you've become so skilled at avoiding discomfort that you've also started avoiding yourself. Perhaps that's why certain emotions feel strangely dangerous, even when no real danger exists. Saying what you actually think feels risky. Needing reassurance feels embarrassing. Admitting that you're hurt feels heavier than carrying the hurt in silence. None of these reactions appear dramatic, yet they quietly shape almost every conversation you have. You edit yourself before anyone else has the chance to reject you. You soften opinions that mattered to you only moments earlier. You convince yourself that staying quiet is simply being considerate, without noticing how often silence has become another way of disappearing. What's unsettling is that these habits often earn approval. People appreciate the person who is easy to be around, who never creates tension, who always understands everyone else's perspective. They rarely see what it costs. And after hearing the same compliments for years, a strange confusion develops. You begin wondering whether people care about you or whether they care about the comfort your absence of needs provides. That question is painful because it reaches beyond relationships. Eventually, you begin treating yourself the same way. You become patient with everyone else's mistakes while quietly resenting your own. You forgive other people for being overwhelmed, yet criticize yourself for feeling tired. You tell yourself that you're simply being disciplined, realistic, responsible. But sometimes responsibility becomes a language that hides self-rejection so well it no longer sounds harsh. There is another contradiction that hides beneath all of this. Many people spend years trying not to be misunderstood, yet almost never allow themselves to be fully known. They reveal the acceptable parts, the capable parts, the calm parts. The moments of uncertainty stay hidden. The resentment remains unspoken. The grief is translated into busyness. Then, somewhere in the middle of an ordinary day, they experience an unexpected loneliness and cannot explain where it came from. But perhaps loneliness isn't always the absence of people. Sometimes it's the distance between who you are and the version you've spent years presenting. Over time, adaptation becomes so familiar that it begins wearing the clothes of identity. You say, "I'm just not an emotional person. I'm just someone who doesn't ask for much. I've always been independent." Maybe some of those statements are true, but maybe they also contain decisions you never realized you made. Decisions formed during moments when needing someone felt unsafe, when expressing disappointment seemed pointless, when expecting too much only led to more hurt. The habit survived long after the moment that created it disappeared. That may explain why changing your circumstances often leaves this feeling untouched. A different job, a healthier relationship, a new city, even success that once seemed impossible. None of them automatically reconnect you with yourself, because the distance wasn't built only by where you lived or who surrounded you. It was quietly maintained every time you dismissed a feeling before fully hearing it, every time you convinced yourself that your emotional needs were somehow less important than everyone else's comfort. And perhaps the deepest conflict is this: you don't actually want to disappear. You only learned that disappearing made life easier. Easier to avoid rejection. Easier to avoid disappointment. Easier to avoid becoming too much for someone else. But what protects you from pain can also protect you from the parts of life that make you feel unmistakably real. That isn't an obvious realization. It's one that arrives slowly, almost reluctantly, because accepting it means questioning habits you've mistaken for your own nature. Once that possibility appears, even faintly, something begins to shift. Not your circumstances, not your personality, not your entire life overnight. Just the way you look at your own emotional world. And sometimes, before anything changes on the outside, a person first has to recognize that what felt permanent may have been learned, and what was learned may not be the whole story. The next part doesn't begin with changing these patterns. It begins with seeing them differently for the first time. And that small change in perspective may be more unsettling than any answer you've been searching for. Perhaps the first change isn't something that happens in your life at all. Perhaps it happens in the way you begin interpreting the life you've already been living. For years, you may have looked at your exhaustion and concluded that something was wrong with you, that you weren't resilient enough, grateful enough, disciplined enough. But what if that exhaustion was never simply a lack of strength? What if it was the natural weight of carrying a version of yourself that required constant maintenance? There is a quiet difference between living according to your nature and living according to the habits that once protected it. From the outside, the two can look almost identical. Both can appear responsible, calm, adaptable, thoughtful. Yet one feels surprisingly light, while the other always asks for a little more effort than you can explain. That's why some people arrive home after an ordinary conversation feeling strangely drained. Nothing bad happened. No argument took place. They simply spent another evening carefully arranging themselves into someone easier for the world to hold. When you begin seeing that pattern, something unexpected happens. Instead of asking why you're so emotionally tired, you begin noticing how often you've been negotiating against yourself. Every small compromise seemed insignificant on its own. You ignored an opinion because it wasn't worth discussing. You accepted plans you didn't want because disappointing someone felt heavier than disappointing yourself. You convinced yourself that your discomfort would pass, while someone else's discomfort demanded immediate attention. None of these moments felt important enough to remember. Yet together, they quietly shaped the person you became. That realization carries an unusual kind of sadness because it isn't directed at anyone else. It's the sadness of recognizing how patiently you've waited for permission to become more honest with yourself. Not dramatic honesty, the kind that changes everything overnight, but ordinary honesty. Admitting you're tired before pretending you're fine. Acknowledging disappointment without immediately explaining it away. Recognizing that some relationships don't make you feel safe enough to be fully present, even if nobody has done anything obviously wrong. This perspective also changes the way you remember your past. Certain choices that once looked like weakness begin looking more like attempts to survive emotionally. You stayed quiet because speaking had once felt costly. You avoided asking for help because depending on others had once ended in disappointment. You learned to anticipate everyone's needs because being predictable felt safer than being fully seen. Looking back through that lens doesn't erase the consequences of those habits, but it does remove some of the unnecessary judgment you've carried toward yourself. There is another shift that is easy to miss. You stop dividing yourself into simple categories like strong or weak, confident or insecure, independent or needy. Human beings rarely fit those clean descriptions. Someone can appear remarkably capable while quietly longing for someone to notice they're struggling. A person can enjoy solitude while also grieving how difficult closeness has become. You can genuinely care about others and still lose sight of yourself in the process. These contradictions aren't signs that your identity is fractured. They are reminders that emotional life has always been more complicated than the labels we give it. As that understanding grows, you may notice that your memories begin changing shape. Moments you once dismissed as insignificant suddenly reveal something they had been carrying all along. That uncomfortable silence after saying what you really thought. The unexpected relief when someone accepted a boundary without becoming angry. The conversation where you almost admitted how overwhelmed you felt, then changed the subject at the last second. None of those moments were random. They were small glimpses of the life you had been trying to protect and the self you had been quietly leaving behind. Maybe the deepest shift is realizing that you were never trying to ruin your own life. You were trying to keep it emotionally manageable. The problem is that a life built entirely around emotional safety often becomes emotionally distant. Not because you stopped caring, but because every instinct became focused on preventing discomfort instead of experiencing life honestly. Somewhere along the way, safety and aliveness slowly drifted apart, and you learned to choose the first without noticing what the second was costing you. That doesn't immediately answer every question you've been carrying. It doesn't suddenly make relationships easier, quiet the overthinking at night, or remove the feeling of disconnection that may have followed you for years. But perhaps it changes one important thing. Instead of looking at yourself as someone who is fundamentally flawed, you begin seeing a collection of emotional habits that once made perfect sense, even if they no longer lead you where you hoped to go. Sometimes clarity arrives without making any noise at all. It doesn't announce itself with certainty. It simply changes the way you look at the same reflection you've seen every day. Until one morning you realize you are no longer asking, "What's wrong with me?" Instead, another question quietly takes its place. When did I begin believing that disappearing was the safest way to live? That question may stay with you long after this video ends, not because it demands an immediate answer, but because it gently follows you into ordinary moments where the answer has been waiting all along. Does any part of this feel familiar? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Tell me in the comments what resonated with you the most. Or what quiet realization you've been carrying that you've never said out loud?